Every once in a while I mention that I wish for the Mass that we had 2 hours, but none of you would come back. Because it's tonight, like tonight's readings, where I wish we could sit around tables and discuss some of this, because it's so central to all of us. First of all, the rule of law in our lives and in our society. Why do we have laws? And how do we get the laws? How do we know that the law should be observed, and how do we observe them? Think about it. Because so often human nature, what it is, and I think this might be common to most of us, we want to know what the laws are. We want to know what the limits are. We want to know maybe what God wants of us. And then we try to figure out how to observe them, and if we're honest, how to weasel out of them. That's why we have the 10 Commandments. That's the basic laws that we got from God. And you've heard me say this before. The 10 Commandments are not if you have a big highway to God, the 10 Commandments are not the center, they're the guardrails. If you break a commandment, you know that you're off the road. But the law of Jesus, what he gives us, that's kind of the center of the highway. Like he himself modeled, giving himself totally and fully out of love for others and, of course, for us. But that's the law. But then the problem is that so often we can get obsessed with following the laws and we forget the purpose of the laws. That's what happens to a lot of human nature. That was the Pharisees in tonight's gospel, for instance. They were so concerned about the laws that they made other laws to protect the laws, and then the other laws became more important than the laws. As an example, the third commandment is to keep holy the Sabbath day. So, out of the teachings of Moses, the observant Jews discerned that they should not work on the Sabbath, because that was not honoring the Sabbath, giving Sabbath to God. So they started to decide what was work. And they said that anything that might tempt us to work on the Sabbath must also be eliminated. So if you're with me so far, for instance, striking a fire was considered work because it could lead a person to cook meals, for instance, and that was work. So those were the prohibitions. When I was on sabbatical in Israel back in the 80s, there was a big battle going on about movies on the Sabbath. The rabbis were out stoning people who would go into the movie theaters on the Sabbath because they considered it wrong for 2 reasons. Number one, observant Jews never exchange money on the Sabbath. That's considered work. But they got around that by buying their tickets ahead of time. But then the real crucial point was, in the old days for movie theaters, they used an arc lamp, a fire, to project the image. Well, in order to start the fire, you had to strike a match. That was considered work. And that was the big controversy. And we have it all the time in our lives. You know, I'm not just criticizing them, because some people get more concerned about the rules that lead up to an observance than actually the observance. And then we start to think, what's the minimum requirement? Now, the reason for that is in our humanness, we think that if we follow the laws, then God is pleased. God is pleased. And that's why it's in our human nature to figure out how to please God, but then everything comes from us. We think by doing what we have to do to please God that we earn salvation. If we do this or that, if we say our prayers every day or whatever, then God is pleased and we can get to heaven. But then we think it's what we do. And then you have people that are more, the Catholic Church has the rule about going to Mass every weekend. So we get more concerned about going to church, going through this ritual, than being church. What we do here is supposed to change us. Or we get more concerned about the ritual of baptism than living baptism. We get more concerned about going to communion than being communion. And we lose our sense of direction. And that's what Jesus was talking about in the first reading about Moses giving the law so that people would know how to follow God. So the first thing, obviously, is to know what the laws are. What is the will of God? And so often people think the will of God pertains to every little action we do. I don't think so. Jesus gave us the will of God, the two great commandments: to love God with our whole heart, mind, soul, and strength, and to love our neighbor as ourselves. I see that as the umbrella over all of our actions, and that's the law of God. How we live it out, I think God leaves up to us. I don't think God is concerned about the little picture. And I know I'm being silly, but I don't think God cares whether I stand here or stand here. He leaves that up to me. All of the things of life, He leaves that up to us. If we follow the overarching law, and not to be so concerned about the little things as the big things. And again, our worship together. If we think we're doing something to please God, then we, as I said earlier, we start to weasel. We start to think, well, what's the minimum requirement so that I can please God with coming to Mass? That's why a lot of people regularly come late or leave early, because they think, well, I've done the minimum, therefore God's pleased. No. God wants the fullness of our hearts to take place. And in the gospel reading about the washing of cups and jugs and so hands, they knew nothing about hygiene in those days and germs. These were external rituals that they believed if they follow, again, God would be pleased, and that they would stand right with God for what they did and not something that God did for them. The second reading says, every generous act of giving is a perfect gift from God. Everything is a gift from God. If only we could get that through our thick skulls. And then as we live this out in our humanity, what's in our human heart? And this is where we could really have a good discussion. Do you think the human heart is full of badness, and then once in a while we do something good? Or is the human heart basically good, but sometimes we slip into badness or sin? Some theologians believe that the human heart was a big pile of manure covered with snow. And other theologians think, no, the human heart is basically good, but it's spotted with selfishness. Well, that's what all of us experience. Because the long list that Jesus gives in the gospel, I'm not going to repeat it because it makes everybody feel so bad, but those are all some of our inner tendencies, and that each one of us probably has one or two of them. Hopefully nobody has them all, that we struggle with. We struggle with. And whatever we struggle with, we have to be able to limit ourselves so that we don't give in to those tendencies. See, we live in a culture that just absolutely idolizes freedom. Nobody wants any limitations on anything. But if we're honest, we human beings, we have to limit ourselves. We can't just do everything we want to do. If you're on a diet, you have to limit yourself. If you're on a diet, I suggest you don't go to a candy store or a baker shop. Not that it's wrong, but don't you have to limit yourself? If you have trouble with drinking, you shouldn't go into a bar. I cannot have ice cream in my apartment. Because if I wake up in the middle of the night, I can hear it call to me from the freezer. I have to limit myself. On the farm, we have an old saying, if you give a calf enough rope, it'll hang himself. That's our humanity. We're talking all about the sex abuse of children and the cover-up. I wrote an article this week in the Bulletin, and it's just that struggle that some of the priests in the past, probably still in the present, are struggling with certain things within themselves, but they haven't found out how to limit themselves, to discipline themselves. That's the struggle. That it's not just external, it's internal. Whatever each one of us struggles with, we've got to discipline ourselves. It's not just in hearing the word, it's in the doing, as St. James said tonight. Historians tell us less than 100 years ago, a politician in Europe was a very pious man, always talking about God, how wonderful God was, how he believed in the Almighty. He was espousing Christian principles. He would show his Bible, how well worn it was. He gave pious stories to the press. Everybody thought he was a man sent from God. Do you know his name? Adolf Hitler. He struggled but couldn't control it. We struggle, and we can control it with our devotion and presence of Christ. Not just readers of the law, but doers.